Good evening, and welcome to Understanding the Roots of Racism, Social Capital, and Civic Engagement. Thank you for joining us tonight. At this time, please welcome United Way of Central Indiana CEO and President, Ann Mertlow.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this 7th session of our series, Understanding the Roots of Racism. Our first 6 sessions covered the topics of health, housing, food insecurity, transportation, education, and financial success. Tonight, our panel is addressing how systemic racism has impacted the way Black and immigrant communities build social capital and engage in our civic and political systems. We're here tonight because United Way is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything we do. We acknowledge that to move forward in our journey as an organization, each of us must first understand the roots of the problem, so together we can tackle and overcome systems that grow and perpetuate racial inequity in our community. I quickly want to thank the thousands, yes, the thousands of you who have logged on to join us for these discussions over the last 7 months. Together with you, United Way is committed to doing our part to create a more equitable Central Indiana. I want to remind you that if you have missed any of those sessions, you can still view them on our YouTube page or website at uwci.org. If you've joined us before, you'll notice that tonight's panel looks a little bit different than those that have come before. Throughout our nation's history, young leaders have always been on the forefront of the fight for equity and justice, and today is no different. The members of our panel tonight are all young leaders making their mark in Central Indiana, leading a new generation of Hoosiers to tackle and solve some of our community's most persistent and challenging problems. I'm delighted that they agreed to join us tonight. Before we start, please know that I too am here to continue my learning. So upon the start of the discussion, I'll be disappearing from the screen and listening alongside you at home. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce you to the moderator for our session this evening, Vivian Carter. Vivian is one of the youngest members of our United Way team. She is a natural leader who always leans into any opportunity to make the community she calls home a better place. Her infectious enthusiasm for Central Indiana and United Way's community impact initiatives make her the perfect person to lead tonight's discussion. I'm so thankful she agreed to moderate what is certain to be an enlightening and engaging conversation. Vivian, thank you again for your leadership tonight. The virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Anne. I am honestly thrilled and honored to be here as your moderator this evening. I know many of you have heard the advice, it's not what you know, it's who you know when trying to find a job or becoming more involved in the community, or even just being successful in everyday life. In the wake of growing national movements to raise public awareness and accountability around issues such as public health, education, policing, and voting rights, young voices here in Central Indiana have stepped up to organize groups and lead in powerful ways. Often in history, diverse voices have been diluted rather than lifted up, diminishing their impact. Today, with knowledge, passion, and social capital, a new generation of leaders is emerging to tackle some of our community's most daunting challenges head on. Just last week, we witnessed 22-year-old American poet and activist Amanda Gorman become a household name because of her incomparable message of unity and hope. During these often too divided times, Amanda and her work is just one of many examples of young professionals creating impact through civic engagement. It is our hope upon the conclusion of this panel, you too will feel inspired to take positive steps in our community. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear from young local leaders who inspire change right here in Central Indiana. And without further ado, I am excited to introduce tonight's panel. We'll start out with Yasmin Anderson, Director of Operations for Black Women in Charge. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Sean Harris, Manager of Equity Advancement, Indianapolis Public Schools. Next, we have Sarah Hindy, Community Engagement Coordinator, Exodus Refugee Immigration. And lastly, but certainly not least, Brandon Randall, Director of Engagement, Voices Corp. Now that you've met our panel, I'd like to go ahead and get this panel discussion started. The two-gen approach, short for two generation, is fundamental to United Way's family opportunity strategy. We work to build family well-being while being intentional and simultaneous while working with children and the adults in their lives together. The approach recognizes that families come in all different shapes and sizes and that they define themselves. Social capital is a key element of the two-gen approach because it provides the family, peer, community, and professional networks that help us all be successful in meeting our fullest potential personally and professionally. As young leaders here in Central Indiana, how do you define social capital and what systems exist that prevent people from accessing or increasing their social capital? Yasmin, I'm gonna kick it off with you.
Well, hi, Vivian. Thank you so much for having us once again. I love this panel, so I'm really excited. At Black Women in Charge, if you all don't know what Black Women in Charge is, it's a 501c3 nonprofit based in Indianapolis, and we mostly work on policy and legislation. A lot of you probably came to our protest over summer, so thank you so much for supporting us from that point forward. And now we've moved into revising and, I guess, implementing a lot of different laws, including the use of force policy for IMPD and their discipline matrix and a bunch of their other policies. And now in 2021, we are getting into our public health segment where we're focusing on food deserts, food insecurity, starvation as a whole for every minority. And then we'll also be getting into mother and infant mortality rates and mental health within young men. So today, in terms of social capital, I feel like Black Women in Charge has significantly benefited from social capital in a number of ways that I would have never imagined that we would have. And I would probably define it as all of the resources that, as a young person in particular, come from your parents, of course, the educational environment that you're put into, your economic socio-status, and a lot of other things that are out of our control in the beginning, but then come into our control as we age, and we definitely have the power to wield them in positive ways. And BWC has done that by becoming just a liaison between what you would call corporate America, quote unquote, and the community. So we're really excited about it.
Wonderful. Sean, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Thanks, Vivian. I would define social capital as one's ability to access people in spaces where decisions that impact the lives of others are made. I think that once you have social capital, you have the ability to influence these decisions. And when I think about barriers of like accessing these spaces, I think about just the legacy of systemic racism within our country. And what I mean by that is that there is a legacy of policy decisions, social practices, and beliefs that still have impact on historically marginalized communities. So an example, like your education, where you went to school, the level of attainment can impact whether or not you can access these spaces. Where you live, who you're in community with, impacts how you are able to access those spaces. So if you're going to talk about social capital and that ability to have that access, you also have to talk about that legacy that keeps people from accessing those spaces.
Excellent, thank you. Brandon.
Yes, so hello everybody. As far as social capital, coming from the perspective of somebody who works with young people, I think that we have to at redefining what social capital means and not stay within these boundaries and these boxes of traditional social norms, right? So young people look at social capital as how do they engage with their peers? How are they contributing to their community? An example, so I live near Washington and Rural, right? And when I'm driving down 10th Street, if I see a group of young people who are hanging out in front of the marathon, that is how they're building their social capital. And I think some people will look at that in a negative way, but we have to reshift this narrative of deficits and looking at that as an asset, because that's engagement, right? And as far as what are things that prevent folks from building social capital, like Sean said, the institutions of racism and white supremacy. And we see how that trickles down into our schools, our neighborhoods, and the creation of these traditional expectations instead of allowing folks to define their own method of capital.
Thank you for that. Sarah, I know you bring a different perspective. I would love to hear what you have to say.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, in terms of the definition of social capital, I think the wonderful panelists have defined it really well, so I don't have much to add there. But in terms of the context of the clients that we welcome and serve in Indianapolis, so as a refugee resettlement agency, we welcome and serve refugees and other forcibly displaced populations who have fled their home countries due to reasons of persecution, of race, religion, political opinion, social group, and they are in search of safety and they are in search of a better home. And for so many of our families, it's life or death for these families that we welcome in Indianapolis. So when you talk about, and a lot of times when we talk about refugees and even immigrants too, we talk about what they gain from coming to the United States, but I don't think people understand what people lose and when they do, and they leave behind a lot, like their family and their friends, and they leave behind so much for the hopes of a better future, not necessarily for adults, but for their children and for their families, so that they could build generations that don't have to live in persecution. And when you asked this question, I even thought about one of our clients that we welcomed a few years ago, a mom and dad and 2 children, originally from Syria. The dad was a pharmacist in Syria and he owned a pharmacy. And the mom was a stay-at-home mom and they have 2 young kids. And then they fled to Jordan because of the war and violence in Syria. And then they were resettled in Indianapolis through Exodus refugee immigration. And the dad, educated dad, always provided for his kids, has a pharmacy degree. When he came to the United States to start a new life, his pharmacy degree didn't mean anything. 1, because he didn't speak the language. And 2, if you no matter what degree you have from overseas, or you have to take extra classes or take certain degrees or certificates to have it be equal to the degrees in the United States. So for a lot of families, they really do start all over so that their kids could have a better life and better future here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And all of you have pretty much given your own definitions to social capital. Social capital can be defined as the practice of developing, maintaining relationships that form social networks willing to help each other. Now more than ever, Black Americans rely on a network to help them succeed professionally, because opportunities for upward mobility in places nationwide are still limited in comparison to their white counterparts. From your point of view, what can employers do to help employees build their social capital? And how can we continue to build communities of support for our neighbors? Sean, I'd like to start with you here.
Sure. I immediately think building the infrastructure for your staff members to be able to go and connect with other folks within the community. I just think about my own personal experience with IPS. I've had 3 different roles within the organization. And I just think about the key difference of starting off as a 4th grade teacher and spending most of my time with little people and not really having time to connect with other folks in the community, but coming to an administrative role and having that flexibility to walk in and out of the office to go grab coffee or lunch with so many different people in the city. It's honestly been transformational for me personally, because I've gotten to know more people maybe in the last 2 to 3 years compared to when I first started, and I've been here almost 6 years. So what that could look like, I know I have some IPS folks tuning in. Maybe there's a professional development where you carve out time for your team members to go and just connect with someone they normally wouldn't talk to or have never met before. And then in terms of what's happening here in Indy, there's so many different organizations that have developed fellowships and programs solely for the purpose of connecting other folks. So I think immediately of the 1828 Leadership Project with Indy Hub, or Indie Black Millennials or the Exchange at the Urban League who like have the infrastructure. So if you encourage your team members to go out and access these programs, then they're going to be more likely to connect with folks more intentionally in the city.
Absolutely. Yasmin, do you have anything that you would want to add to that?
Only thing that I would add is that with the space and time that employers need to give their employees, they also need to give them the resources to build their own tables. A lot of times I see corporations, I won't name any in particular, but we'll just say large corporations holding their employees down with the hopes that they won't leave them. But in reality, your employees can't flourish at all, even in your workspace that you're providing them, if you're not allowing them to do things that are outside of their interests, build their knowledge. I mean, education, you could say, is one thing, but I think the resources for the most part to build their own tables, maybe not at your table that you've already provided them with, but to just go out and make society better. But that also has to do with corporations being very individualistic, which is one thing I remember Sarah in our talk a couple of days ago talking about, and it just feeds right back into that.
Absolutely. And one thing you mentioned, Sean, that I love and totally agree with is professional development meetings. I have to say, before United Way of Central Indiana, I came from a different company, and I can't tell you how refreshing it was to join a group that is actually invested in me as a human and what I want to do. And I have a team of people that's behind me at all different levels supporting me. And I just would add that that's really, really important for young professionals, any young professional, but especially young professionals of color. Sarah or Brandon, do you have any more ideas that you would want to add here?
Yeah, I would encourage all the people who are on here participating, understand the importance of supporting young people and getting them engaged. So like here at Voices, if I'm going to a meeting, whether it's at the mayor's office, whether it's with funders, we're taking students with us, because we can't continue to speak and advocate for young people authentically if we don't involve them in those spaces. And so we need their input, we need their feedback. And so for funders, there should be some sort of support system to encourage young people to be involved in these processes as well. We shouldn't just expect for the adults to do this, but there needs to be some collective encouragement for young people to be civically engaged, but also having the young people define what civic engagement looks like.
I love that, Brandon. Thank you so much. So I'm just gonna switch gears here just a little bit. Data shows that majority Black and also immigrant communities can be more insular and less socially connected than majority of white communities. Why do you think that is? And from your perspective, what are a few concrete steps that can be taken in Central Indiana to correct that disadvantage? And Sarah, I'm gonna start right here with you.
All right, thanks, Vivian. So I think we have to first understand maybe the history and why this is happening in the first place. In general, I don't know if a lot of people tuning in know, but Indianapolis is known to be the largest Burmese population in the United States, which is really cool. And they primarily live on the south side and the north side of Indianapolis. And the second largest population that we have welcomed and served through Exodus are folks from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And when welcoming and serving vulnerable populations, we realize that when they do come to a new country in a new city and they don't speak the language, they're relying on one another to really build up their social capital and have that collective communities aspect. Because as Yasmin mentioned, our clients quickly learn that America is very much an individualistic society, and they come from cultures and cities and towns where the whole village raises everybody's kids, right? Everyone's taking care of one another and looking out for one another versus, in Indianapolis, they might not necessarily have that because they don't know anyone and they don't know how to build that up. And so communities tend to live together also to help them navigate the barriers that they are facing in the cities. So for example, childcare is a huge issue in a lot of our communities, and specifically with the refugee and immigrant communities. And so people are able to, their neighbors are able to work together in terms of like their work schedule, so that one person could watch everyone's children and then other adults can go to work and vice versa, and change up their schedules so they can rely on that, because childcare is so expensive. And similar to, again, transportation barrier, where we see so many of our clients carpooling together to work because, one person has been here for a few years, they have a driver's license and a car and car insurance. And so they're able to carpool with take their other neighbors to work as well to help them build that up. So and I think it's not a data that we should be like, pointing fingers at and saying like, why are people not assimilating? Why aren't people coming in? Why don't they want to be from this country or this city? It's, the word assimilate is a word that I personally, like Exodus, we don't like to use at all, because, just ask yourselves, what does an American look like and what does American culture mean? And I think we need to expand that horizon and realize that all of us make up America, and we are all America, not just a certain group of people. And I could even come from a perspective of, as a Muslim woman who wears hijab, I'm in certain spaces where people don't think I'm an American, or when they think of that term, I am not what they think of an American. So it's important to kind of change that mentality and rhetoric that certain people belong in our cities. And if they're living in neighborhoods next to each other, that means they're not in a part of our city. No, they're working, their kids go to school, they're, accessing the same resources, healthcare services that everyone else is, and they're already a part of our city. And I think something to keep in mind, other than, changing our rhetoric behind kind of how we view refugee and immigrant communities, but also in terms of not dehumanizing and criminalizing our neighbors, because that's how we take, that's when we dehumanize and criminalize people, we think not our problem, not my neighbor, I don't care about them. And then we other that person and leave them out of conversations, and we leave them out of our city. And so it's important to do that. But second of all, when you advocate in different spaces, for example, education in the city, and advocating that every child should have access to equal educational opportunities, and we should fund our schools so that they have access so our kids could go to college. You're also advocating for the refugee and immigrant children in those schools, because for a lot of these kids, their parents didn't go through the American educational system. So they want their kids to go to school and they want them to get an education, but they might not necessarily have that advice or guidance. And so a lot of our youth and our teens and our clients, our kiddos specifically, are building that social capital from their educators. And they're the ones who are helping them get through, graduate from elementary to middle school to high school, and then to go on to college. And so I think no matter all the important issues that we advocate for in the city, ensuring that we're also, refugee and immigrant communities are also included, because they're being impacted by those decisions.
Excellent. Thank you. That was beautifully said, Sarah. With that said, Yasmin, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I was raised with a very strong emphasis on the grammar and verbiage that you use when describing other people and how that can affect them. So to me, the words like insular and less socially connected in the question in and of itself should not reflect that these people are insufficient or that they don't belong. But it's also important when we're recognizing what these people mean to us as an American community, that we don't recognize them as illegal instead of saying immigrant, or undocumented versus saying like alien. Because when you use those words like that, that creates a natural divide that doesn't make people want to be a part of the community that you think they came here to be a part of. It actually makes them want to be less of a community, because it makes us feel less welcoming. So no matter what the government or whoever pushes all these different terms, it's just important to recognize what effects that does have on an individual, and how that can make them feel, even in their own neighborhood and space, that they pay just as much as you do to live in.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Shauna and Brandon, I'm seeing you shaking your head. Is there anything else you want to add after these two incredible ladies?
I don't have anything to add. I'm just like in alignment with what was said. So
Awesome. Okay. Alrighty. So the 2020 general election saw increases in voter turnout across nearly every demographic, but especially among young and Black voters. Exercising the right to vote is one of the most important ways to engage locally and nationally. Now, my question for you all: how do we as a community continue to ensure every voice is heard in the electoral process? Sean, I'm going to kick it off to you now.
Yeah, so I just think of a few things. I think like there is a very huge emphasis on voter turnout. And I don't think there is the same level of emphasis on like the civic engagement process as a whole. We really push people to get out and vote, but after we get people in office, it's pretty much it. And I just like automatically just think of like access. Like voting is not easy. The entire process is not accessible. And I think we have to name like the legacy of like these types of processes, specifically for like Black folks and like communities of color. I just think immediately to like my most recent experience. I stood in line for 8.5 hours to go vote. And no one should have to do that. And there were many times that I wanted to get out of line, but I chose to stay. And then I also just think about like just politics as a whole are very daunting, and they're not really accessible across audiences. So like it takes a very specific person with a very specific skill set to like tune in and stay engaged. So everyone's not gonna wanna, track bills or read 200-page legislations. Pieces of legislation. I'm one of those people. I study political science, but like I'm still personally not running to go read 300- and 400-page documents. So I think we have to figure out, how do we keep people engaged in the process? How do we let folks know that like these decisions impact you personally? And if you are not in support of them, or you are in support of them, there are ways for you to come engage. So coming to school board meetings or city council meetings and letting your voice be heard, knowing who your legislator is and being able to access them, and then feeling like they were responsive to your concerns. So I think that if you're going to put the same emphasis on voter turnout, you have to do it for every single facet of the civic engagement process if you want folks to truly invest and remain engaged.
Thank you for that. Brandon, do you have anything that you would add here?
Oh, yes. So yes, voter turnout is important. And then like what Sean mentioned, the whole process of civic engagement. But we need candidates who are actually culturally responsive to the community that they're serving. The problem is a lot of people run for elected offices, and they promise a lot of things during their campaign, but when they get elected, they fail to stand 10 toes on what they spoke about, right? So we need people who understand like the perspective of all of the people that are voting, right? And the ones who don't vote. We can't get into the mindset of only serving demographics that we have data that guarantees they're going to head to the ballot box. But we need to find out, why are people not voting? Is it because they have a distrust in institutions who have continually harmed their communities? And if that's the case, where does that healing begin? Where do we find candidates from these communities and encourage them to be somebody that can be an elected official, because they already have the pulse of their community? We need elected officials who are willing to be in the trenches in these communities, whether it's in the city, if it's rural, if it's wherever it is. We can't have elected officials that they only come to the city when they do a church tour, or if they're, speaking on the podium and determining what is morality and what is trauma. We can't have those type of elected officials. We need people who actually know what's happening with the people that are turning out to vote for them.
Excellent. One thing that I also would just ask for you, Brandon, I know specifically you work with a lot of youth, and what we've seen this year, we've seen youth get out and vote, but I also want to talk with you about how do we, as their peers, right? Like they look up to us. These are people,
Absolutely.
they believe in us, they trust in us. You hinted to this level of mistrust. How do we get them to trust in us? Because like it or not, the way our system is built, like our voice, our dollars, that is our vote. So from your perspective, can you tell me, how do we do that? How do we be better peers for them? How do we be better mentors?
Right. Yeah, the accountability is not on them. The accountability is on us. So, we have to understand, and I was explaining this the other day, a lot of the students I work with, they're not worried about who they need to vote for. They're worried about if they're going to be, if they're going to make it to their 16th birthday, their 18th birthday, so they can vote. A lot of the young people I work with are dealing with a lot of mental health, poverty. And so if you have to balance, am I going to eat tonight, or do I need to care about who my local city county councilor is? I need to focus on my basic needs. And so what we need folks in the schools, in the communities, local politicians. We need people to collectively understand that until basic needs are met, folks are going to be disconnected and disengaged, because politics is not a priority. When you're trying to feed your family, you're trying to find out if you're going to have a place to stay. And so, and I think that a lot of elected officials, they care about that when it's campaign time, but they seem to forget that that is an ongoing work. That is 24/7, 365. It's not something that you can address during business hours. Like, these are people's literal existence. And until we have elected officials that actually care enough to make themselves available outside of 9 to 5, we shouldn't expect for people to trust them or trust these institutions.
Thank you, Brandon. Beautifully said. Yasmin, I would like to ask you the same question, because you are the youngest on our panel. You are actually, for those who do not know, Yasmin is still, she's in her junior year at Xavier University. So do you have any feedback to add here? I would love to hear what you have to say.
Well, as a 20-year-old, this was my first election, and I was so excited about it. I would not have ever picked in the last life a better election to be my first election. So from a legislative perspective, just thinking of what Sean said, we at Black Women in Charge have found that you are not the only person that is significantly uninterested in the legislative process. So the tactic that we use is to sort of, I guess you'd call it piecemeal, big pieces of legislation with like pretty revisions on them. And then we like give people the opportunity to revise them at home. And we make it like an interactive experience, but in very small layers, because the actual legislative department of Black Women in Charge is revising anywhere between 4 and 5 different pieces of legislation, whether it be for public health or the police department at one time. But when we tried at the beginning of it all to post all 5, people got really overwhelmed, and they did not know what the words were. They did not know what verbiage, once again, was being used to interpret their actual laws that they're supposed to live by. So once again, I just feel like the disconnect between the legislative process and the community is not on accident. It is by every means intentional. In our communication with the police department, they do run an undercover operation that they do not want anyone to be able to interpret. So as a community liaison, we have had to try to make it pretty and fun, which it's still not, but we're kind of tricking the community into being their own lawmakers, being their own legislative members, because there's no other way other than to read the cold hard documents and make the long, tiresome revisions. That's just how, unfortunately, our society works. And I'm just really happy that the community up to this point has been receptive, especially the young people. But aside from that, Black Women in Charge being a 501c3, just as United Way is, I personally love politics. And one of the things that we signed in our contract is that we cannot have any political views. And so when we sign that away, we had to start getting really creative on like, so how are we going to sell the election, not to a candidate, but to a community? Like, how are we going to sell the entire voting process without selling a candidate? Because we knew who the majority of our community wanted, but we could not advocate for that person simply based on our nonprofit registration status. So the way that we went about it was, for the most part, just to explain that your civil rights will be violated under these specific legislations that this candidate supports, that this candidate supports, this candidate doesn't, and really just handing people the information and then they do with it what they will. But one thing that Black Women in Charge is really, really big on, probably a thing that we highlight most often, is just transparency between, once again, in corporate America, the legislative offices that our social capital has put us in the offices to be in, even at such a young age. But we just want to make sure that as the future goes on, and I think that our current administration and whoever else should be in charge in the future, I'm really excited that people are getting to see what used to be behind the scenes and what usually makes the biggest impact. So that's what's exciting to me.
And I have to agree with you. Transparency is going to automatically lead to more trust. Sarah, is there anything that you want to add here?
I think regarding refugee immigrant communities in terms of civic engagement and voting is that people don't all know that refugees after a year are eligible to apply for their green cards. And then some immigrants already have green cards too. And so then they have to go through the process to get citizenship. And so after 5 years of living in the United States, immigrants can go through the process to become citizens. And they have to study for a 100-question civics exam that most Americans who are born and raised in this country don't know how to answer. So I think it's just very funny to me how we, if you're born in this country or or your parents have citizenship, then they're able to give you that citizenship. And so then, life is much easier for you versus like if you're in the process to become a citizen, first of all, every action that you do can be counted against you, like whether it's a speeding ticket, a parking ticket, whatever that may be, but also that, that civics exam that people have to take. So a lot of times, and just how the system is set up in the immigration system, we hold immigrants and refugees and other folks who move to the United States to a higher standard level so that they could like prove their Americanness versus like people born and raised here don't have to prove that.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that perspective with us. I think it's time that we move on to our next question. I know that we are all young professionals, and I'm sure somewhere, some close to all of you, is a cell phone, Facebook, Instagram, something lingering up. Yep, I see you over there. But I just want to ask, with the continued evolution of technology and the popularity of social media, which is great right now, because could you imagine social media with the pandemic right now? Like, whew, what would we be doing? We're being able to be kept connected in ways none of us probably would have ever imagined. So I would like to know, in your opinion, how can social media be both helpful and harmful in building social capital? And are there ways it can reinforce disparities and isolation given the digital divide facing many communities with high poverty? Yasmin, I'm going to open this one up to you.
I would say that from a 20-year-old's perspective, the last time I did not have a social media platform was when I was in 7th grade. And I'm in my junior year in high school, I'm college right now, sorry. So needless to say, I don't really remember like my social life before social media. I'm pretty sure it was just like my cousins, like at my house all the time. But now I would say that it is the deepest realm of the simulation, and that there's no way that you can there's no quicker or more efficient way to get any information across that you could ever think of to any number of people that you could ever think of. And that is terrifying and also wonderful. It is the only reason that Black Women in Charge thrives how it does, because all of our members from Jump had a pretty substantial following on our individual accounts. Then people saw what we cared about and decided they cared about it too. But I can't imagine what it would have been like. I'm really not even sure where we would have started for like even the advertisement of the protest, for example, we only advertised on social media. Our legislative policy revisions, we only get those out to the community to be liaisons in the legislative process through social media. So I personally don't know how to operate in society without my phone, because I've never had to. I've never had to be a productive member of society without technology, social media, and social capital. And I can only see it getting more complex and more important as the future goes on. I really don't see social media ever going away. I just see it exploding day in and day out. So we better embrace it.
I have to say, I am not too much older than you, and I feel like you just aged me by that conversation.
I'm sorry, I didn't
want everyone to know when we were reaching out to all of the panelists, Yasmin responded way quicker on social media than she did to her email.
The Black Women in Charge email is flooded and you don't get notification. It's not efficient. It's just not efficient. Instagram makes sure that you see what you need to see.
I just wanted to say that and mess with you a little bit. I'm so sorry. I just had to say that because I do remember a life without social media. Sean, I would love to hear what you have to add here.
Yeah. So I would say that like social media can be a really powerful tool because it gives everyone a platform. So regardless of what your race, how you love, your socioeconomic status, everyone has access to this tool and this platform. I think the caveat to that is that everybody has access to this platform or able to like use it to do whatever they want to do with it. And it can be used to like really spread harmful messaging and content that like impact the daily lives of like historically marginalized folks. And like, while I do believe in free speech, just because you can say something doesn't mean that you should. And then I guess my follow-up question to that is that why is that your speech? And then like just another thing that I think of is that social media can be used to build social capital very quickly, but I think you can also lose it just as quickly with cancel culture. And what I mean by that is that people who have like influence or social capital, if you will, when they mess up by saying something problematic or engage in something that isn't inclusive, they're trending on Twitter and people are talking about how they're done. I'm not listening to your music, I'm not reading your books, I'm not coming to your shows. And I think a fear of that has developed within our society, where when people mess up or do something problematic, there isn't really growth that happens. Like there's an apology issued, I'm sorry for offending you, but I don't think there's like really like any like shifting work that happens with that person. And I used to be really subscribed to like cancel culture, but like recently I've been looking into call-in culture. And it's a term that was coined by Loretta Ross, who's like a professor in African-American studies and feminism. And she asserts that when people mess up, you can call them out or you can call them in. And the difference is that when you assess, does this person have the capacity or the willingness to want to unlearn problematic behaviors and grow as a person? If the answer is no, then she recommends not expending that emotional labor to try to like get through to that person. If the answer is yes, then we have to call them into the conversation and have grace for their journey to do this work. Because once you learn the terminologies and once you understand how identity works and you're able to identify how these different power dynamics show up in our society, it takes time to get there. And a lot of times I think when people get there, they don't have grace for other folks that are on their journey. So I just wanted to like just put that out there.
Brandon, I just saw you come
Yeah.
off. You look like there's something you really need to get out.
Yeah. So I do support you know, the call in versus call out, but I think it's also important to say that a lot of the calling in, especially around issues of racial equity, that is us white folks' responsibility, right? So when it's issues around race, equity and inclusion, anything that has to do with racism or race, it is not people of color's responsibility to bear that labor. And so I wouldn't expect for Sean or any other person of color to feel like they have the responsibility to call in a white person that messes up, right? Like on Facebook, I'm telling people all the time, tag me. Like if somebody is out of pocket and they are making comments that are racist or very inappropriate or colorblind or just anything that is not okay, then tag me, because I don't need you to expel that labor, that work, feeling like that's your responsibility when it's not. White folks, we have to hold each other accountable and look at how we are engaging each other, not only civically and socially, but institutionally, organizationally, and systemically. If you are a CEO, and there are several on this call, it is your responsibility to look at your policies and your bylaws and how are you expecting for people to apply for grant funding? How are you providing grant dollars? You have a responsibility to call in not only individuals, but also the processes of these institutions. So we have to do better. And white folks, it is our job to do that, okay?
There's two things that I want to point on just quickly. You mentioned color blindness, Brandon. Can you go into a little bit more of what you mean by that for anyone on the call who may not know what color blindness means?
Yeah, so color blindness is when we are having conversations about racism and Black Lives Matter and centering, the movement for Black lives. A lot of white folks will say, well, I don't see color. Everybody bleeds the same. We're all created equally. That is a lie. Color blindness is racism's cousin. So we have to do better at understanding that color blindness is not real. And the problem is, if you don't see color, you are literally erasing somebody's cultural and historical human existence. So that's not a compliment. That's not a way for us to build a bridge for you to say you don't see color. That is literally you reaffirming that you are either racist or you adhere to white supremacy. So do better.
I will agree with that. Also, Brandon, I have to say, just for everyone on the call, and I think Sean, you also alluded to this, equity is a journey. We are all on our different equity journeys. And one thing that I always have to listen for is intent, because it is very hurtful as a person of color when someone says, oh, I don't see color, because to me, you may think you're being politically correct, or you may think that you're being nice, but I'm thinking in my head, great, so you don't see me, you don't see the experiences that come with me, and you're not interested in anything that I have to bring to the table. So I really appreciate you breaking down colorblind. And I also want to allude to Sean's point too, that I personally do not feel that cancel culture is productive. I think there is an accountability piece that I like about canceled culture, but I don't think that that's how we get to the results that we want, right? We see the fake and the big, oh, I'm so sorry, but there's no true accountability there. Yasmin, is there anything that you would add here?
To the topic of cancel culture in particular?
Oh, to the topic of cancel culture, to any of Sean or Brandon's points, or just the question in general.
I appreciate what Brandon said about white people calling other white people out, but I wish that it would sometimes be people that they can relate to. Well, I guess just an expanding piece, not really, but I've been in classrooms where I'm the only Black child, for example, and then the white child will say something that's racist or whatever to me, and then the white adult doesn't feel like it's within their realm to get involved in a child's conversation, things like that. So I just really don't think that it's only the accountability piece of white adults confronting white adults, white children confronting white children. I think that everyone within an entire race group has to become accountable for everyone within that race group as they evolve, because we do see each other as a monolith, whether or not we are or are not. I think that it's important to start being knowing what's within your rights, yes, not wanting to like cross lines, like be insensitive or whatever. But if a child, I feel like it just really starts at home, but then it also does start in your educational institution, and teachers in particular, which is one group of people that we like to highlight as a society in terms of the essential need of them, but they're just as educationally essential in terms of academics as they are in terms of political correctness, what kind is, what nice is, because you don't know what that child is learning at home. And I feel like if you're just teaching them math and English well, and you're not teaching them the correct human skills and how to identify a human properly, then you are failing at your job.
Sarah, going back to our social media question and the evolution of social media, what would you add to this conversation?
So I was going to make a comment first about cancel culture. I am guilty of this for unfriending people on Facebook. Come on, y'all, we've all done it, okay? And I think Brandon really did a good job of highlighting this. But, you know, as an American Muslim Arab woman, you know, I've experienced and continue to experience Islamophobia for many, many years since I've been in this country. And I see it all the time on social media too. And then all of a sudden I see it from my own Facebook friends too. And it's easier, much, much easier for me to engage with someone about my culture and my identity and my religion when they're open to listening and when they admit that, hey, I've never met a Muslim before, or I don't know much about Islam, but can you, help, answer some of my questions, or can you tell me a little bit about yourself? It's much easier for me to engage with that person versus someone who is Islamophobic and already has a fear of my own identity and existence when they don't know me and they just like have a view, an idea of who I am. So sometimes I have used that, like the unfriend on Facebook, for my own mental health, because I am tired. I am tired of bigotry and Islamophobia and hate. It has long existed in our country. It is unfortunately what our country was founded on, but I think we need to continue to do better and move forward, which is why we're having such important conversations. But sometimes you just gotta do it for your mental health's sake. But in terms of social media and how the good of it, I guess from an agency standpoint, I think this has already been mentioned, but sharing information and sharing more about the work that we do. And it's been especially important even during a pandemic, because our physical office is closed right now and has been since mid-March. And so I've used social media a lot to share client stories, to share about our needs. In September, we welcomed 30 clients, and before that, last year, and before that, refugee travel was on hold for a few months because of the pandemic. And so I did a call to action on our website, on our Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And I said, hey, we're going to welcome several families in the next few weeks. Can you please donate something from our Amazon wish list to help us, buy household items or kitchen supplies for the families that we were going to welcome. And that just received so much attention because I think people were looking for ways to get engaged and get involved and help out. And they're always wanting to be updated about kind of how can I help, and social media as an agency has really helped us use that platform.
Can I comment on something that Sarah said in the beginning?
Please.
Just about because my dad's Muslim too. And when I was younger, when everyone would find that out, they would figure out my name and stuff. And I've converted now as an adult, but just as a young person, I don't want people to ever feel like no one owes you an explanation of their identity. If they decide that they want to share that with you based on ignorance that you've shared with them, then that's one thing, but it's not up to you in some space to come up to someone and interrogate them because you feel like they need to be a part of what you need to be comfortable with. And that just gets back to the insular communities. If they want to be insular, then they will be. And if they want to stay that way, then they will be. They don't owe it to you to not be insular.
That was lovely, Yasmin. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective there. That was just social media and young professionals. We're so passionate about it. I love it. Our next question. A recent Brookings study found white women had the largest networks, followed by white men, Latinas, Black women, and Black men. As young leaders in Central Indiana, how are you building your network and social capital? And what tips do you have for your peers looking to get even more connected in our community? I'm going to start with Sarah here.
I think just take it, like in terms of when I was an undergrad, not too long ago at IUPUI, and I had this, not typical journey, but I think freshman year, I didn't really know what I wanted to major in or what I wanted to do, or, what even skill set or what I even knew what to do or was good at. And so I really struggled with like kind of figuring that out. And then sophomore year, I declared my major in public affairs and media because it had classes that were in political science and journalism in the nonprofit sector. And so it was a wide variety of classes of all the different things that I enjoyed learning about. And my dad, who has an undergraduate and master's degree in engineering, I remember he was saying like, you want to do what? Like, why? Like, you go to college to get an education so you can have a career. Like, what's your path? Like, what are you trying to build here? What are you trying to do? And I remember he just had a very honest conversation with me about like, are you ready to navigate a space that Muslim women aren't in? And I remember thinking, oh man, he has a point there. And then I looked at him and I responded and I said, that's exactly why I need to be in this space. And that's why exactly I need to be in this classroom and in this major and get this degree and go and, figure out and like maybe go into the nonprofit sector, which was a sector that I was interested in because it was a space that was not known for Muslims to be in, or even like folks that looked like me to be in. And I knew that that was an important thing to do. And so, of course, my parents supported me through this journey, although they also continued to question it at the same time. But I really relied on my college professors and my mentors in college, but also my high school teachers in terms of like relying on them to either for connections, but also just for support in terms of just, you've got this, or keep going, or, here's your, think about your goals or what you're going to work on. And also in being a student at IUPUI, my own friend helped me, get connected to my first internship. And that really took it off for me because I didn't know where to start. And so I don't think we realize it, but even as college students, like benefit using we don't realize like then our own networks that students have too. And so my friend helped me get connected. And then I've used that to continue to network and attend public events and get involved.
Wonderful. Sean, same question to you, jump right in.
Sure. I think everybody who knows me knows that I love a program and I love a fellowship, particularly because of like the networking piece and like people that you don't know are essentially brought to you. So it's not like that awkward piece of just having to like walk up to like random like strangers. Like you're placed with a group of folks who are going through a very similar experience. And like that's already like one connection. So I just think of like my ties to like being a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, from doing Teach for America to the programs I'm like currently involved in. Like I've had the opportunity to meet some really amazing people over the years. And one thing that I've made a habit of doing is that whenever I do meet someone new, when our time is almost over, I ask, is there anyone else in the city that you think I should know? And automatically they're thinking about 2 to 3 people that they can connect me to. And if I meet with them and I ask that question, I'm just getting funneled all these different people that I can connect with, so that when someone needs something or has questions or just needs resources, I have like a Rolodex of people I can like point them to, solely because folks have been willing to just sit down and connect with me. So yeah, get out and talk to folks.
Sean, I will say, I haven't known you very long, but I hope I know you forever. And literally, as you said that, I thought about our first conversation together and was like, yep, he literally asked me that. And when I asked him for resources, you had resources, Jimmy, on the spot there for me. I feel like I just either saw, Brandon, did I see you come off mute? Okay, come on in.
Yeah, so one thing, I think we should question the Brookings Institute survey, because I don't agree with that. I don't know who they polled, but I would say that in my personal experience, Black women are the most connected. I am where I am at in my career because of Black women. Whether it's my current supervisor, Kia Wright, whether it's my friend Arnetta Scruggs with the Bloom Project, whether it's Sherry and Farron, like my social, my career circle has been maximized because of Black women. Black women are also, according to research, if students have teachers that are Black women, they typically have higher academic outcomes. We also know that with the historically Black colleges and Greek organizations, have you seen the AKAs and the Deltas come together? They turned out in Georgia, okay? So the Brookings Institute might want to reach out to more extensive demographics. And so, but that is also a part of how do we define connected? How are we using standardized whitewashed terms to define that? Because in my head, I'm thinking social capital as socialization. And to me, because of, even it goes back to the comment earlier about insular, folks have to protect their space. And so when you're protecting your space, you're protecting your community and your people, that reinforces connection. We have to do a better job at questioning who's presenting these definitions and how are we reinterpreting them to be more relevant.
Thank you. Yasmin?
Yeah, I agree with Brandon in terms of Black women being the most connected, and the way that I was raised to be efficient in my personal networking, I would say, is that you have to, as a Black woman, display depth, range, passion for the longest list of the pieces of society, whether that be, I'd never been to a protest, honestly, before George Floyd, and then the next protest I went to, I had to lead it. So it's like I had to display that I was capable of being new to something and also being the best at it in terms of academics, or being just the most professional in the room, and just keeping all of the standards to the highest level, because you can never allow someone to assume that you have slipped in the past or that you will slip in the future. As a Black woman, we know the standards are always higher. As in really women of color, period, the standards are always higher. But aside from that, I think that Black women in terms of connectivity just have the strongest form of community when it comes time to show it off. Just as Brandon noticed, I don't really have any doubt that my community is going to stand up for me, my organization, my rights when it comes time for that. And I never have had an issue with, Protect Black Women is, I'm actually president of a clothing brand, GPG, and that's like one of our slogans, Protect Black Women, because among everything else that I need to do on a daily basis, I do have to make sure that as a Black woman, I'm being protected with the people that are around me, and that I'm protecting the Black women that are around myself as well. So just having that camaraderie and that sort of natural looking out for each other quality, you could call it, has been really powerful in my academic, personal, social life, and everything in between.
Wonderful. Brandon, I want to go back to you just really quickly again, because I know that you mentor and work with a lot of youth through your through the Bloom Project, obviously, and with Voices Corp, and ask you the question in a similar way. How are youth building their network, and how can we, again, as their peers, as their mentors, keep them connected in our community so we're keeping them safe and so that they're thriving?
Absolutely. So I need all funders, all nonprofit administrators, and all educators to listen to me very closely. You need to eliminate the phrase at-risk youth from any literature that you publicize. Because if we want young people to be socially engaged, socially connected, we cannot start them out with marginalizing them with very harmful and destructive labels. Whether a young person has been in foster care, DCS, juvenile justice, that does not mean that they are at risk. It means that they are a young person who is still at promise. And in order to do that, we cannot continue to fund organizations or be complicit in poverty pimping and pimping out young people for grant dollars. So if there are CEOs on this call, superintendents, anybody with any type of power, if you have the phrase at-risk youth in your literature or on your website, you are complicit to the destruction of Black and brown communities, because those are the communities that are more likely to be harmed in that term. So do better. listen to young people, focus on young people who have systems involvement, get their feedback, put them on your boards, your committees, and your advisory councils post haste without question. And if you have questions on how to do that, please email me and I can help guide you along this process.
Brandon, I have to say, this is the first time I have ever heard anyone use the term at promise. And I think we all on the call as young professionals can respect the fact that words, oh my gosh, do words matter? And I love the fact that the organizations that you are using and you are promoting folks to use the term at promise. I think that is beautiful.
And let me just say, I did not coin that. Victor Rios did a TED Talk, and it's called From At Risk to At Promise. And he talks about how he was one of those students. So definitely look it up on YouTube. It's a TED Talk, and it's very powerful in how we label young people and how we have got to get away from deficit-minded approaches.
No, that's wonderful. Yasmin, Sarah, Sean, is there anything else that you would want to add this evening? It's been a beautiful panel, and thank you so much for engaging in this conversation with me. I knew y'all were going to be great.
I guess I'll just say two things. One, we spend a good amount of like this time talking about Black women, and I just wanted to shout out Black women. Like, Black women show up for everybody, even when they don't deserve it. So I challenge you to show up for Black women when they need you to show up. And then two, this has been like a great conversation. Brandon, everything you've said about At Promise Youth is really important. If you are an organization or an individual that supports young people or represents the interests of young people, get more involved than just like giving your money. Yes, the money is needed, yeah. But once you write your check, does like your commitment to equity people, does it end right there? Or are the organizations that you are writing checks to, do you actually go and see what the work is doing? I think like if we want to make sure that the work is getting done and we are censoring young people, like you have to do more than just give your money. You have to give your time, whether that's access, making room for someone, maybe stepping out of the way. So I just challenge you to get more involved than just like writing the check.
Excellent.
And I would just want to second what Sean said about that, because I think and especially what I noticed over summer in particular with like the protests and everything, everyone wants to give their money. But it's like, what about bringing like water to the people that have to sit out in the sun for 3 hours? What about like hooking us up with some speakers so that we can hear, like all 10,000 people can hear? It's the small things that are not just your money. We need your time, space, energy, resources. We need everything that you as a privileged individual, and I'm a privileged individual too, but we need everything that as a privileged individual you can offer, because you know that someone else will never be able to accumulate it themselves or without your resources. That's really important.
Thank you for that. I think it's important that we have folks that give their time, their talent, and their treasure. Thank you for bringing that up. Sarah?
I don't have anything to add, but since we mentioned time and talent, and I just wanted to give a shout out to our volunteers and our supporters who make this work possible, and to the volunteers who mentor refugee families or mentor refugee youth, because they believe in the power of being a good neighbor, and that, you know, no matter the challenges and traumas that our clients have faced, and refugees and immigrants and so many other communities in the United States, they still have a chance to and an opportunity to thrive just like everyone else when we are able to mentor them and invest in them.
Absolutely. Thank you all again. This has been an incredible conversation, even more incredible than I could have ever imagined. So thank you to each and every one of you for your literal time, giving me space. Yasmin, I know you had class tonight. Thank you. And tell your professor we appreciate them letting us borrow you. And I just want to thank our entire audience on this call right now. I'm not sure how many folks we have listening, but I know we have hundreds of you who are giving your time to hear young voices and how we're making an impact in our community. So thank you so much. I hope that this conversation has left you inspired and ready to create an even more equitable Central Indiana for all those who live here. Please know that you will receive a full email with tonight's recording, additional resources, the panelists' incredible bios, education materials, and a link to register for next month, yes, next month's Understanding the Roots of Racism topic, which is covering mental health, a very important topic indeed. With that, I will leave you with this. Thank you so much for everything you do and do for us, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.